Welcome to the 12th and Blossom Art Club. Today we are going to be painting a prickly pear cactus. You'll need an eraser, a pencil. I've got a couple of paintbrushes in two different sizes. You can just use one. And I'm also going to be using my Ecoline liquid watercolors. You just need 4 colors: yellow, green, blue, and pink or red. And if you're using pans or tube watercolors instead, that's fine. And we'll talk about the difference in a minute. The first thing you're going to want to do is to create a light line, sort of a quarter of a circle here on the right hand corner of your page. This is going to be our largest cactus piece. My lines are a little bit dark because I want to be sure that you can see what I'm doing, but you'll want yours to be as light as possible. You're going to draw an upside down egg right here. This is going to be maybe a little less than like 1/5 of the page. And then another upside down egg right here on the left-hand side. If your image doesn't match mine perfectly, that's fine. Your cactus can look however you want it to look. We're going to create 3 little eggs here on top of the largest piece. And these are going to be the buds from which the flowers grow. Again, yours can look however you want it to look. If you'd like fewer flowers or more flowers, that's up to you. You also see, and I should have mentioned this earlier, that I've taped off the edges with some washi tape. Again, not a requirement, but it does help. And now I'm going to erase the lines that overlap between each of my cactus pairs. All right, I'm going to prepare my palette by putting a little of each color on here. Now, again, I'm using liquid watercolors. With these, I like to do 2 to 3 drops of each color on my palette. If you're using tubes or pan watercolors, you'll want to do the same thing. Just mix a little bit of the color or grab a little bit of the color that you need and create different spots on your palette for each of those colors. I want to be sure mine are far enough away from each other that they don't bleed. And then I don't want to use the color right out of the bottle. So I'm going to grab my pipette full of water. You can do this with just a brush, but I like using a pipette because it lets me control the amount of water I'm putting in. So I'm putting just a little bit of water into each color to make sure that I'm not using too much pigment. We're going to start off with a wet on wet technique, and if you watched my basics video, you'll know that we're just creating a wet base on the paper to add our wet watercolors to. So wet on wet. I am just filling this with water, which is why you don't see much of a change to the paper. One of the things we want to do in watercolor, in almost any watercolor painting, is we want to start with the lightest of colors and move into the darkest of colors. So we are going to be adding some green to this in a very, very light tone. I'm going to go just a little bit into these other palms or other pairs with my water. I don't want to go into the whole thing yet, and I'll explain why in just a second. But once I've got about that much taken care of with the wet on wet, I'm going to add a little bit of water to my green. I'm going to start dropping it in, and you can see that paint is already starting to spread itself. Once I've added enough of this paint to this larger part of the cactus, and again, I just want to do a very light color, I'm going to start pushing the water into the smaller parts of the cactus. Now, I could have wet the entire cactus when I started off. I would have started from the bottom to the top and added some water to the entire thing, but by the time I got down to the bottom again, my paper might have been dry. So in this case, what I like to do is get a good chunk of it wet and then start to push the water in, adding water as I go. It lets me have a little bit more control. We like to say in watercolors that as long as it's still wet, you've got control, even though the water kind of moves itself around. There are a lot of things you can affect as the artist as long as you're still working with water. I did speed this part of the video up, so if it seems to be moving a little quickly for you, just pause it and go ahead and fill in the rest of your cactus. Again, you want to kind of push some of that color and water into the spots that you haven't touched yet. Now, once you're done filling up this cactus with your very light green, we're going to add a little bit of yellow. What we want to do is imagine that we've got a light source coming from the upper left-hand side. So we want to make those parts of the cactus just a little bit lighter. So we're going to add some yellow and mix it maybe with a little bit of green in just a second, but we're going to add some yellow first to the spots where the light might touch first on this cactus. So on each of those pears, I'm just going to get a little bit of water. Now, I'm not really painting this yellow on, I'm really kind of touching it on. So I lightly touch the green with the yellow, and because it's still wet, it's going to start spreading on its own. I'm going to mix a little bit of this green with the yellow too, so that it's a nice smooth blend. Now we're going to paint over this, but because watercolors are transparent, that yellow is going to show through. And when you're done adding the yellow, you're going to pause this video and let it dry just a little bit before we do the next step. Okay, this is going to be fun. We're going to add a little bit more green to the palette, away from the yellow. I don't want these to blend together. And you can see my paper is a little bit drier than it was in the last step. So I'm going to take my brush, add a little bit of water to that green to let it move around a little bit more. And what I'm going to do is throughout this entire cactus piece, I am going to add what I call amoebas. And the reason we want the paper to be a little drier, you'll see right here, that when I create this amoeba, I've got some hard lines. If my paper was still wet, these would be really soft lines and the color would be bleeding into the others. And I don't want that right now. I want some harder lines. So I'm going to create these amoebas. Just any shape you want. You just want to make sure that none of them touch each other. And as you paint this, you're going to be like, what is she talking about? I don't understand how this is working. Just trust the process. All right, and here's another place where I decided to speed up this video a little bit because these amoebas took me a little bit of time. So again, if this is going to move too quickly, that's fine. Just go ahead and pause the video and work on this at your own pace. What you want to do again is to create these amoebas all throughout the cactus. And you don't want any of those pieces to touch just yet. You'll see that I needed to add a little bit more water to my palette, and then later on I need to add a little bit more paint to my palette to make sure that I've got enough to work with. So just continue to work your way up the cactus. We are going to cover every single piece of this in amoebas right up to the buds. And when you're done with this, you could let it dry. You don't need to let this dry for our next step. It's going to, it's nice if it bleeds a little bit on the next step. And here's where you're going to see how bad I am at keeping my colors separate. So on this next step, I want a little bit more green, but I want it to be greenish yellow. And so I'm going to pull those together again right here. And I want this to be nice and watery. In fact, I want to make sure I have plenty to work with, so I'm going to add even a little bit more green and even a little bit more yellow for this next step. I do want this green to be different than the green I've already laid down in those amoebas to give it a little bit more dimension. So I'm going to start at the top and work my way down, and I'm going to create another set of amoebas overlapping the first set. Again, these amoebas aren't going to touch each other on this layer, but they are going to touch the layer beneath them. And we're going to try to fill in all of those different gaps that we've created with the amoebas. We are not going to go all the way to the bottom here just yet, though. So stick with me on this one, because we're going to start to add some of those other colors in. We want to keep the paper nice and wet for this. So if yours is like mine, your cactus is looking a little bit like a giraffe or a cow right now, but I promise it's all going to come together. But again, you'll notice that I'm covering up all of those gaps in between the first set of amoebas, but I'm not going to go all the way to the bottom of this cactus. And I'm going to get the little guy too, but I'm not going to go quite all the way to the bottom. All right, well, here comes my favorite part. We're going to add in a little bit of color. So I'm going to grab my pink or your red if you've got your red. Now, I don't want a lot of this, so I'll add plenty of water to it. I'm creating sort of a lighter version of my pink over there on the side, and I'm just going to start dropping the color in. I like to put this pink almost like a shadow on each of these on the sides of my cactuses. So you'll see it starts to spread itself around. I add a little bit of green here and there, but I want to keep it nice and wet so it moves around a bit. Of course, the pink and the green together give us sort of a brownish color. It gives it a very natural look. I'm going to add a little bit of it under each of these buds and under the larger pears too to make it look like a shadow. But this is where you can play around a little bit and you can decide where you want that pinkish brown to go on your cactus. Play around a little bit, see where it looks good, see where you want a little bit more pink. I tend to like to add quite a bit of pink to these, so I like the mixture of colors and I like the way they flow together. Again, there you see, sometimes I just drop it in and sometimes I spread it around, but as long as your paper is still wet, the paint will move around quite a bit and blend really well with whatever's on the paper already. We're going to get those little shadows underneath the pears again. Oh, I'm going to take care of these little buds and then I'll take care of the shadows. But we're creating shadows here on the edges of these guys. Again, just to give it a little bit of dimension. We don't want this whole thing to be one bright green color. But hopefully you can start to see that that giraffe-y version of a cactus is starting to get a little bit more dimension and look a little less like a giraffe. Here, we're going to add that shadow right there under the pear and then under this one too. And our greens are all still pretty light, so we're going to want to create some darker green. I'm going to add the green back to my palette, and now I'm going to mix it with just a little bit of the blue to create sort of a turquoisey green, a bluish green right here. I just love this color. And we're going to add this to the base of each of these pears. Again, letting those colors bleed into each other. Hopefully your cactus is still wet enough to do that. If not, that's okay. Just add some more water and try to move it around. But what we're trying to do is give it a little bit of depth here so that we can tell this part of the cactus has a little shadow on it. This part of the cactus is in the sun. And again, we just want to add those extra colors in, let them play with each other, because you won't see a cactus in nature that's just bright green. All right, I'm playing a little bit here to get a nice dark green that I like to finish out my amoebas. I'm going to create just a few more amoebas here at the bottom of my largest piece of cactus to fill in those white spaces and keep adding some dimension here. And what I love about a project like this is just the more you play, the more intuitive the colors become. And you'll kind of feel yourself saying, oh, you know what, this needs more pink right here, or I would wish I had a little more blue right there. But don't be afraid to play around with it. There's a great artist I follow that says, you know what, if you mess up, it's just paper and you can try again. All right, we can't forget those little buds on the top, so I'm grabbing a little bit more bluishy green right here. And I'm going to add a little shadow to the base of each of those. Now what I did just there was remove some of the paint from my brush so that my brush was a little drier and I could get a little of the excess paint off. Okay, I love this bit. We're going to create a purple, so you'll want to mix your red or your pink and your blue together. And this doesn't quite cut it for me. I need to add a tiny bit more pink to mine to get a nice purple. It's important here that your paper is still a little bit wet. If it's not, it's okay. I'll show you how that'll work too, but it'll work better if your paper's a little bit wet. So we're going to make a nice deep purple here. And this is where I'm going to switch to my smaller brush. You don't have to. I just think it makes this step a little bit easier. So I'm going to grab the smaller brush here and pick up some of that purple paint. And I'm going to drop in some dimples just here and there. And you can see where it touches the wet paint. It just gives it almost a shadowy look rather than a really hard line because it starts to blend really easily with the paint. There are a couple of places you can see where my paper is not wet enough and I've got those harder lines. On those, I just added a little water to my brush and helped the paint spread just a tiny bit. But I'm going to add these dimples to the entire cactus. These are where the needles would be. Now, we're not adding needles today, but you certainly could. You could go in with either a black pen or brush, or a white pen works really great, like a white gel pen, and add some needles. I do mine without needles when I'm working in watercolor. I just like how it looks. And again, I'm going back here in the spots where my paper wasn't quite wet enough, and I'm just adding a little bit of water to help those dimples blend in a little bit. I don't want the dimples to be the focus. I'm almost like pulling the paint off the paper with a drier brush so that it's hints of dimples rather than polka dots. I'm going to add these to the buds as well, of course. All right, the next thing we're going to do once we're done adding those dimples is we're going to add the flowers right here on the buds. My flowers are going to be pink, but I often see orange and yellow cactus flowers too, so whatever color you prefer. But what you want to do is we're going to start light. So I'm going to add a whole bunch of water to my pink here. And I'm going to start with the bud all the way on the left-hand side. If you're left-handed, you might want to start with the one on the right. Getting plenty of water in there so I can give it a nice layered look. I'm going to start by creating these kind of leaf shapes at the top of each of the buds, almost like a little crown. And I'm going to do the same thing to each of them where I'm just adding a couple of little points. I'm not making these flowers too big, but sometimes in the spring here in Texas, I see really big flowers on some of these. On the first two, I'm going to do fuller flowers, and on the last one, I'm going to make it look like it is just starting to bloom. So I'm going to make it a little bit smaller and more compact. Again, start with a really nice light version of whatever color you're using so that when we go back through, it gives it a little bit of a layered look. Again, these are kind of hard lines that we're starting with, kind of like the amoebas, but we're going to soften them up in just a bit. And by the time you're done with your third bud, it's probably dry just enough to move on to your first bud again. We're going to get more of the paint, and we're going to just drop in the color here at the bottom. Like I said, it's drying a little bit, but it should be wet enough that you can just drop this color in and let it sort of flow, giving it a little bit of a shadow. And what I'm going to do, again, I'm just going to drop this color in and let it flow up to the tip of those petals. But I'm also going to add some purple in just a second to give it even more dimension and shadow. You can see my pink is kind of going into my green, and that's okay because it's creating a nice little shadow effect there too. So here's the purple. I'm just going to drop it in on top of that darker pink in little bits. I'm not going to be too heavy with my brush. In fact, I'm being very light with my brush. Just adding a little bit more shadow to it. I love how that looks. All right, now I'm going to go back in and soften my petals just a little bit with some pink. I'm going to go around each one and sort of what I'm doing kind of is adding some wiggly lines around each spike so that it doesn't look so harsh. When I see those prickly pear flowers in person, they almost look fluffy to me, like a feather boa. So that's sort of what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of fluffing them up a little bit. And you can tweak those petals as much as you like. You can kind of have some fun with those. I want here, now this is an optional step, but it's one that I wanted to do. My lines were a little bit sloppy, I felt like. So what I did is I went through with the blue and with the dark green, and I just kind of defined my lines a little bit on each of those. I just added a thin outline, and then I used the brush to kind of pull the color down into the rest of the cactus so it wasn't such a harsh line. I'm going to use some dark green here and just create some more defined lines. I had that pencil in there too. Remember, I drew my pencil a little bit more darkly than I should have, but this will help cover that up as well. And just give everything a little bit more definition by adding those darker lines in there. So just to explain that process again, I'm adding a dark outline or a highly pigmented outline right here to the edges of this little pear. I dry my brush just a little bit, and then I kind of shuffle along the edges to pull that color into the pear itself and not let it be too pigmented on the outside. But that is about it. There is your prickly pear cactus. Now you can paint the background if you'd like to with a soft blue maybe. I'm going to go ahead and leave mine white, but you can do whatever you choose. And I really hope you will share your version of the prickly pear cactus on our page for everybody to see. I can't wait to see what everybody has done.